Good day. Today we will talk about the most dangerous killer in American history, Edward Flint. He hid from the police, destroying his enemies and instilling terror. Edward Flint was born in a small town on the outskirts of America into a quiet and prosperous family. His childhood seemed ordinary, but from the very beginning there was something strange in his behavior. Unlike other children, Edward showed no interest in interacting with them. He often preferred to play alone, spending hours reading books. The unusual choice of literature for his age attracted the attention of his parents, but they did not seriously worry. After all, many children are interested in strange things. However, over the years, Edward's hobby acquired increasingly darker shades. He began to immerse himself in books about criminal incidents, studying the details of atrocities and methods of investigation. His parents tried to dissuade him from such readings, but to no avail. Something was awakening inside Edward, like a dark flame that even the best intentions of his parents could not extinguish. Every day, Edward became more and more closed, more and more lonely. He found that it was easier for him to find answers in books than in people. It was in this loneliness and strange crime books that the dark force that would define his life and make him one of the most dangerous killers in American history was born. Edward's adolescence was a time when his isolation and strange interests attracted the attention of others. He was quiet and withdrawn, often spending time alone, immersed in his dark thoughts and books. Despite his avoidance from his peers, teachers always noted his outstanding academic abilities. Edward was an excellent student who could handle the most difficult materials without difficulty. His intellect was at the level of a genius, and even in the most abstract and complex subjects he found ease and understanding. When Edward turned 19, his life turned upside down. The father, who always seemed to be a reliable and stable pillar of the family, suddenly found himself involved in a fraudulent scheme. The Flint family was devastated, losing everything they believed in. Edward decisively took the situation into his own hands. He understood that he now had to help himself and his family. Having collected the last remnants of money, he left his hometown and went to Chicago, a city where endless opportunities lay before those who knew how to use them. In Chicago, Edward was immersed in a world where the rules were determined not by morality, but by survival. He began to earn money by studying the properties of the city and its inhabitants, learning to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. His keen intelligence and ability to read people made him successful in a variety of areas, from small scams to backroom deals. However, even in this new city, Edward remained the same mysterious and enigmatic. His past and his present were full of contrasts, and his true intentions remained hidden behind a mask of composure and enterprise. Immersing himself in the world of Chicago, Edward began to discover a completely new side of life, the world of crime. Here, in a city where money and power dictated their own laws, he learned what true cruelty and ruthlessness were. Every day he plunged deeper into this dark world. He began to study the structure of criminal groups, their internal connections and methods of work. He realized that here, in crime, money circulates faster than anywhere else, and he decided to take advantage of it. Edward quickly found his place in this world. His sharp mind and incredible analytical skills allowed him to quickly climb the ladder of the criminal hierarchy. He became a valuable player in this dangerous game, skillfully manipulating his brothers in arms and business. But as he delved deeper, he began to understand that the criminal world is just a mask hiding people's true motives and goals. Here he found not only money and power, but also dark ambitions that consume human souls and make them inevitably lonely. Edward Flint's story took an unexpected turn when he turned 20. One day, plunging into the world of crime, he was caught at the scene of a theft. The police were already preparing to put him behind bars, and it seemed that his life was over. But fate had its own plans. At the last moment, Edward received help from an unexpected source. An adult man, the head of one of the Chicago gangs, intervened and saved him from arrest. The man saw something special in Edward, something that could be useful to his gang. The gang leader offered Edward a job, promising protection and the opportunity to start a new life in the criminal world. Edward, having no other choice, agreed. He realized that this was his chance for salvation and the opportunity to start all over again. Under the influence of his new mentor, Edward quickly gained respect and authority in the criminal community. He became an integral part of the gang, taking part in various criminal operations, from thefts and raids to organizing scams and money fraud. The man who saved Edward from arrest was named Jonathan McGregor. He was a legend in the Chicago crime world, the head of one of the most powerful gangs in the city. McGregor was a charismatic and powerful figure whose authority extended far beyond the streets of this city. Jonathan saw potential in Edward that could not go unnoticed. He saw in him intelligence and abilities that could be useful to his gang, but most importantly, he saw in Edward something that distinguished him from ordinary criminals: unshakable determination and desire for higher goals. Under his leadership, Edward began to quickly grow and develop in the criminal world. McGregor became his mentor and protector, opening up new horizons for him and teaching him the intricacies of a cutthroat business. He trusted Edward as his own blood relative, seeing him not only as an ally, but also as a potential heir to his criminal empire. But even among criminals, McGregor remained a legend. His name inspired respect and fear, and his influence extended to much of what happened in the Chicago underground world. In his eyes, Edward was not just a tool to achieve his own goals, but also a man who could change the fate of this entire world. Under the guidance of Jonathan McGregor, Edward began his rise in the world of Chicago crime. He became one of the most trusted men in McGregor's gang, performing the most difficult and dangerous tasks with impeccable precision and professionalism. But as Edward became more and more immersed in this dark world, his actions became more and more cruel and merciless. Periodically, under the cover of night, he became a killer, eliminating his enemies and those who interfered with the execution of the gang's tasks. Edward was cold and emotionless in his actions, as if he was disconnected from his human emotions when it came time to kill. His victims disappeared, leaving only traces of darkness and death, and he himself continued to move forward, not stopping in front of anything or anyone. While Edward continued his work in the Chicago criminal underworld, his inner world gradually began to change. Under the influence of a dark environment and the constant need to act in brutal conditions, he became increasingly cold-blooded and merciless. His soul seemed to freeze, becoming increasingly shackled by the chains of indifference and cruelty. Each new crime became for him only part of an everyday routine, and the blood on his hands simply erased all human traces remaining on him. Even Jonathan McGregor, his mentor and protector, noticed how Edward was moving deeper into a world of darkness and destruction. But for McGregor, this was only proof that Edward was perfect for his gang, a man without conscience or moral convictions, capable of completing any task no matter how cruel it was. And then one day, during one of his assignments, Edward encountered a man whose fate radically changed his view of the world around him. The man had witnessed a crime committed on McGregor's orders, and instead of trying to escape, he looked Edward in the eyes with an expression of pure horror and despair. All Edward thought was important was power, control, and the adrenaline he felt when killing his victims. He liked to feel like he was all-powerful, the lord of life and death, in whose hands lay the fate of those who stood in the way of his gang. Jonathan McGregor, seeing Edward as his worthy successor, supported his cruel actions and mentored him on the path to power and control. He saw in Edward a dark force capable of serving his interests, and did not hesitate to stimulate his ambitions. This went on for many years, and each new murder committed by Edward only strengthened his influence and respect in the criminal world. His name became associated with horror and death, and he was nicknamed the Shadow because he could disappear into the shadows and reappear to perform his bloody dance. But even in the very moments of his greatest victory and triumph, Edward felt that something inside him was beginning to crack and collapse. The voices of his past, which he had suppressed for so long, began to emerge more and more, reminding him of his humanity and what he had lost along the way. But he drove away these thoughts, sweeping them away with the cruelty of his actions and thirst for power. And so, Edward Flint, with each new murder, became an increasingly sinister figure in the shadows, a ruthless killer whose actions frightened even the most desperate criminals. His story became a legend, and his name sounded like a curse in the narrow streets of Chicago. As time passed, Edward became more and more involved in his role as a ruthless killer whose actions are filled with darkness and destruction. His victims were not only those who opposed McGregor's gang, but also influential figures of other criminal groups, as well as politicians and officials whose power threatened the interests of his boss. Edward became a true master of assassins, causing death wherever it was needed, infiltrating the most protected criminal structures, and eliminating his enemies with the cold blood of a predator. His reputation became more and more sinister, and even among the most desperate criminals, no one dared to enter into direct confrontation with the Shadow. But the more Edward committed murders, the more he plunged into the abyss of his own despair and loneliness. Each new act of violence brought him only temporary relief, disguised as confidence and power. The voices of his past grew louder, reminding him of the connections he had lost, and the human connections he had severed in pursuit of his ambitions. Nevertheless, he continued his deadly work. With each new murder, he went deeper into the darkness from which he had once tried to escape. His heart seemed to be hardened, and his soul was consumed by the desire for revenge and control. And so, the Shadow continued his deadly dance, blurring the lines between human and monster, until eventually only a glimmer of humanity remained in his cold eyes. Under the determined attention of the criminal underworld, the name Edward Flint became a fear that permeated every corner of Chicago. Every policeman, deputy, and gang member knew his name, and his reputation was so great that the police tried tirelessly to catch him. However, Edward always acted carefully and professionally, avoiding traps and leaving few traces of his deeds. His skill in circumventing the law was amazing. He used various deceptive tactics to hide his true identity and evade law enforcement prosecution. Impeccably planned alibis, fake documents, and even disguises at the most unexpected moments. All this helped him avoid arrest and maintain his freedom. But with each new murder, each new crime, Edward plunged deeper into darkness. There was no longer room in his heart for humanity or regret. He became a living ghost, roaming the streets of Chicago, causing death and destruction, invisible to the law but inevitable to his victims. The police increasingly tried to capture him, but he was too cunning and experienced to fall into the trap. Every step he took was carefully planned. Every criminal act was calculated down to the smallest detail. And so, Edward Flint continued his dangerous decision, meeting on his way only the shadow of echoes of his past human existence. Remembered as the man who destroyed Franklin Wells, Edward Flint became an even more legendary figure in the world of crime. The murder of the deputy not only brought him a new level of influence, but also caused horror and alarm in criminal circles and among law enforcement agencies. The police, despite all their efforts, were unable to find enough evidence to link Edward to the murder of the deputy. He remained a ghost moving in the shadows, elusive and merciless. Wells' murder marked a turning point in Edward's life. It highlighted his status as a powerful and dangerous criminal, but it also served as a reminder of how far he had fallen from his former self. Each new act of violence brought him only temporary relief, and his soul continued to plunge into the darkness of darkness. But even in this dark world, Edward continued to wander, consolidating his power and expanding his influential connections. His name became a symbol of fear and horror, and his deeds reflected the darkness that shrouded his soul. And so, the shadow continued his deadly dance, attracting more and more attention and causing more and more terror in the hearts of those who heard of his legend. Franklin Wells is an influential Chicago deputy, a man with great political weight in the city. He had significant influence both in government circles and among criminal organizations, and was known for his connections with various criminal groups. Wells used his position to advance his own interests and influence the political situation in the city. His name was well known in both criminal and law enforcement circles, and his murder was an event that shocked the whole of Chicago. Edward Flint carefully studied Franklin Wells for 6 months, monitoring his behavior and habits. He noticed that every 6th day of the month the deputy visits a certain hairdresser. This regularity became the key to Edward's plan. On that crucial day, when Wells went for his usual haircut, Edward was ready. He disappeared into the shadows, entering the hairdresser early in the morning, when the master was just beginning his work. Quickly and silently, he hid the explosives in the clipper, leaving the master to shamelessly continue his work. The next day, when Franklin Wells sat down in the barber's chair, he had no idea that his routine haircut would be his last. As soon as the machine touched his hair, the explosive went off. There was a flash of light, a roar of explosion, and a stream of blood flooded the hairdressing salon. Wells literally lost his head, and the master was left without a hand, the fate of which was predetermined in this bloody tragedy. This murder served as a sign for all of Chicago. No one was safe from the hand of the shadow, and even the most powerful and influential people in the city could become its victims. The power and control that Franklin Wells had so long believed to be his was gone in an instant, leaving only darkness and fear in the hearts of those who encountered what became the now legendary Shadow. Rumors that Edward Flint had assassinated President Kennedy spread throughout Chicago like a wild web of darkness and intrigue. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, these rumors became part of the legend of Edward Flint, giving him an even more sinister appearance and increasing the fear he inspired in the hearts of his enemies. Many years had passed since President Kennedy was assassinated, but the story that Edward Flint was the man behind the act lived on in the city like a curse that hung over it forever. But, as in all other cases, no evidence of Edward Flint's direct participation in this crime was discovered, and his involvement remained only speculation. Some believe that this was just a mythical story created to tighten the legend of Edward Flint and increase his influence. Others claim that his own agents were behind this rumor to give him even more fear and respect in criminal circles. But whatever the truth, this story has become an integral part of the legend of Edward Flint, making him an even more mysterious and dangerous figure in the world of crime. And even if no one could prove his involvement in the assassination of the president, his name remained a sign of fear and horror for everyone who heard about him. The police kept a close eye on Edward Flint, but each time he managed to avoid their traps and remain free. However, when it came to his boss, Jonathan McGregor, the police poured all their resources into the investigation. One day, during an investigation in one of the vacant lots of Chicago, detectives discovered an abandoned room where traces of a person's recent presence were found. After further investigation, police determined that the location was part of a secret hideout used by McGregor as a base of operations for his gang. Detectives began to scrupulously analyze every piece of evidence, examining every corner of the room. A closer look at one of the walls led them to a small irregularity, which, as it turned out, was a disguise for a secret basement. Diving into this basement, they discovered a secret storage of weapons and documents, as well as a secret exit leading to a neglected underground tunnel. Following this tunnel, they came to an old abandoned warehouse, which turned out to be the last refuge for Jonathan McGregor. Eventually, the police stormed the warehouse, arresting McGregor and demonstrating that even those who considered themselves untouchable could not escape the law. This event had a huge impact on the criminal world of Chicago, becoming a symbol of the victory of justice over crime. Edward was sitting in his shelter, surrounded by silence, when suddenly there was a loud boom of megaphones and the sound of footsteps. He realized that his location had been discovered, and the police had already begun their assault. Edward's heart began to beat faster, and his mind raced with thoughts of what awaited him if he was caught. He knew he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, deprived of the freedom and power he so craved. At this moment of decision, he took the gun, feeling its cold metal touch against his palm. Mixed feelings of fear and determination forced him to act quickly. Through the noise of megaphones and screams of the police, he heard only his own inner voice telling him that this was the end of his story. He raised the pistol to his temple. His eyes sparkled with an absent light and his hand trembled with excitement. Then a shot rang out, piercing the silence with its deafening sound. When the police raided his hideout, they found Edward Flint already lifeless, lying on the floor, surrounded by the dark shadows of his past exploits. He had a pistol in his hand, and on his face was an expression of calm that never left him. The suicide note found next to his body contained just one sentence: "I don't regret anything." This is the last evidence of his steadfastness in his beliefs, remaining in the memory of the most dangerous criminal in the history of Chicago.